Mental strength is often misunderstood. People imagine someone who never breaks, never gets emotional, never doubts themselves, never needs anyone. But that isn't mental strength. Sometimes, the strongest person in the room is the one who can sit alone with an uncomfortable truth without immediately trying to escape it. You can hide from almost anything for a while. Distraction, entertainment, work, people, noise, even ambition can become a sophisticated way of avoiding yourself. And eventually, the mind becomes so accustomed to escape that silence starts feeling like danger. Carl Jung understood something deeply uncomfortable about the human psyche. He believed that what we refuse to confront doesn't disappear. It moves into the unconscious and waits. That is why some people appear calm until something touches the part of themselves they have spent years protecting. A small criticism, a rejection, a failure, someone else's success. Suddenly, the calm disappears. Not because the event was enormous, because it reached something that was already wounded. This is where mental strength becomes different from emotional suppression. Suppression says, "I shouldn't feel this." Awareness says, "Why am I feeling this?" One pushes the emotion deeper, the other turns toward it. And that difference can quietly change an entire life. There was a time when you may have believed being strong meant never showing weakness. So you learned to swallow disappointment, hide insecurity, laugh when something hurt, say "I'm fine" when you weren't. Eventually, you became very good at appearing strong. But something strange happened. The emotions you refused to experience didn't become weaker. They became unconscious. And unconscious emotions have a way of controlling behavior without asking permission. You become defensive before realizing you're afraid. You become angry before admitting you're hurt. You become distant before admitting you wanted to be understood. Different reactions, the same hidden mechanism. Carl Jung believed that the shadow contains parts of ourselves that the conscious personality refuses to accept. And perhaps mental strength begins when you stop treating those parts as enemies, because the person who understands their anger doesn't have to be controlled by it. The person who understands their insecurity doesn't have to hide behind arrogance. The person who understands their fear doesn't have to pretend fear doesn't exist. Real strength is not becoming impossible to hurt. It is becoming difficult to deceive yourself. And that realization is far more uncomfortable than any motivational speech could ever be. Because once you begin seeing your own mind clearly, you lose the luxury of blaming everything outside yourself. The moment you stop blaming everything outside yourself, something uncomfortable begins to happen. You start noticing how often your reactions were revealing more about you than about the situation itself. Someone ignores your message. You tell yourself they are disrespectful. Someone criticizes your work. You decide they are insecure. Someone succeeds before you. You convince yourself they were simply lucky. Sometimes, all of those explanations may be true, but mental strength begins with a more disturbing possibility. What if your reaction is telling you something about yourself? Carl Jung believed that the parts of ourselves we reject often appear through projection. You see arrogance in someone because arrogance is something you cannot tolerate within yourself. You become obsessed with another person's success because their success touches a desire you haven't admitted you possess. You become unusually angry at weakness because somewhere inside you are terrified of being weak yourself. The mind is clever. It can turn self-knowledge into judgment because judgment feels safer than recognition. And this is where many people remain psychologically stuck. They spend years analyzing everyone around them while remaining strangers to themselves. They know who is toxic, who is jealous, who is manipulative, who is insecure, who is fake, but they rarely ask, why does this particular person affect me so deeply? that question changes the direction of the entire conversation, because sometimes the person who triggers you hasn't created the wound, they have simply touched it. Mental strength begins there, not when you become immune to people, but when you stop giving every emotional reaction the authority of truth. You can feel anger without becoming angry. You can feel fear without obeying it. You can feel jealousy without turning it into hatred. You can feel rejection without turning it into a conclusion about your worth. That is a very different kind of strength. Quiet, almost invisible. Nobody applauds it. Nobody sees the argument you didn't start, the message you didn't send, the insult you didn't return, the impulse you noticed and chose not to follow. Yet those invisible moments slowly reveal something important. You are no longer reacting automatically. You are observing yourself. And once observation becomes stronger than impulse, your unconscious begins losing some of its control. Carl Jung's idea of confronting the shadow was never about becoming darker. It was about becoming whole, because whatever part of yourself you refuse to acknowledge will eventually find another way to express itself. The person who refuses to admit they need affection may become controlling. The person who refuses to admit they are afraid may become aggressive. The person who refuses to admit they feel inadequate may spend their entire life proving superiority. Different masks, different behaviors, the same hidden wound, and perhaps the most dangerous weakness isn't having a shadow. It's believing you don't have one. There is a moment when self-awareness stops feeling peaceful. You begin noticing patterns you wish you had never seen, the way you seek approval from people you claim not to care about, the way criticism stays in your mind long after the person who said it has forgotten the conversation, the way you sometimes sabotage opportunities just before they become real. And perhaps the most disturbing realization is that you are not always fighting the world. Sometimes you were fighting yourself. Carl Jung believed that the unconscious doesn't communicate through explanations. It communicates through patterns, the same type of relationship, the same emotional reaction, the same mistake, wearing a different face. You promise yourself, this time will be different. Then months later, you find yourself standing inside the same emotional situation. Different person, same pain, different circumstances, same reaction. At some point, you have to stop calling everything coincidence, because patterns are often the unconscious mind repeating a lesson you haven't consciously learned yet. Mental strength begins when you become curious about repetition. Why do you always become silent when someone challenges you? Why do you become defensive when someone questions your competence? Why does rejection make you want to prove yourself? Why does someone's indifference bother you more than their hatred? These questions aren't comfortable, but comfort is not the purpose of awareness. Sometimes the truth has to disturb you before it can change you. People often want mental strength because they want control. Control over emotions, control over circumstances, control over other people. But the deeper form of strength is learning what you cannot control without allowing it to control you. You cannot control whether someone understands you. You cannot control whether someone chooses you. You cannot control whether another person recognizes your value. But you can observe what their behavior awakens inside you. That is where your power begins, not in controlling the world, in understanding your relationship with the world. The person who needs everyone to approve of them will always be emotionally vulnerable. The person who needs everyone to understand them will constantly be explaining themselves. The person who needs everyone to stay will tolerate almost anything to prevent abandonment. And the person who cannot tolerate being alone can be controlled simply by threatening to leave. These aren't character flaws. They are unconscious dependencies. And unconscious dependencies are invisible chains. Carl Jung believed that becoming conscious means becoming responsible for what exists inside you. Not guilty, responsible. There is a difference. Guilt asks, "What's wrong with me?" Awareness asks, "What is happening inside me?" That shift may be one of the quietest forms of psychological freedom, because once you can observe your own fear without immediately obeying it, you are no longer completely inside the fear. You are watching it, and the moment you can watch what once controlled you, something inside you has already begun to change. There is another layer to mental strength, and it is far less attractive than people imagine. It is the ability to disappoint the version of yourself that other people became comfortable with. Because sometimes your weakness is not accidental. It serves a social purpose. You stay agreeable and everyone remains comfortable. You stay silent and nobody has to confront you. You remain available and people never have to experience your absence. You keep forgiving and nobody has to change. For years, you may call this kindness, but sometimes it is fear wearing the clothes of kindness. The fear of being disliked, the fear of becoming difficult, the fear of hearing someone say, "You've changed." And perhaps they are right. You have changed, but not necessarily for the worse. Carl Jung understood that psychological growth often separates a person from the identity they once performed for others. The moment you become more conscious, some relationships begin feeling different. Not because you suddenly hate people, because the old version of you was easier to predict, easier to please, easier to guilt, easier to control. And when you stop reacting in familiar ways, people notice. The person who was used to your immediate apology may become uncomfortable when you pause. The person who depended on your constant reassurance may become frustrated when you stop providing it. The person who benefited from your silence may suddenly accuse you of becoming arrogant, simply because you finally started speaking. People don't always resist your growth because they dislike you. Sometimes they resist it because your growth changes the relationship they had with you. That realization can be painful, because mental strength sometimes requires accepting that being understood is not guaranteed. You can explain yourself perfectly and still be misunderstood. You can act with good intentions and still be judged. You can become more honest and still lose people. The weaker mind experiences this as proof that something has gone wrong. The more conscious mind begins asking a different question. Was I living according to truth or according to approval? That question can dismantle an entire identity. Because approval is addictive, precisely because it temporarily silences self-doubt. Someone praises you, and for a moment, you feel worthy. Someone chooses you, and for a moment, you feel secure. Someone agrees with you, and for a moment, you trust your own perception. But if your sense of self depends on external confirmation, you are never truly alone inside your own mind. You are constantly waiting for someone else to tell you who you are. Mental strength begins when that dependence becomes visible. Not when you stop caring about people, but when caring about them no longer requires abandoning yourself. And this is where the shadow becomes unavoidable, because beneath the need for approval, there is often a hidden fear. Not that people will hate you, but that without their approval, you may finally have to meet yourself. And when you finally meet yourself, there is no dramatic transformation, no sudden feeling of becoming fearless, no moment when every insecurity disappears. Instead, something much quieter happens. You become less interested in escaping yourself. Carl Jung believed that confronting the shadow requires a person to look at what they would rather keep unconscious. The envy, the insecurity, the anger, the need to be admired, the fear of rejection, the desire to be chosen. not to celebrate these things, but to stop pretending they don't exist, because whatever you refuse to acknowledge can quietly begin making decisions for you. Imagine someone who insists, "I don't care what anyone thinks," yet spends hours replaying a criticism. They don't lack strength, they lack awareness of the contradiction. Another person says, "I just want peace," yet repeatedly enters chaotic relationships. Another says, "I hate drama," yet secretly becomes emotionally attached to people who constantly create it. These contradictions are not random, they are clues. The unconscious often reveals itself through the life you repeatedly create, and this is where mental strength becomes uncomfortable. You can no longer simply say, "This is who I am." You have to ask, "Why am I this way?" That question removes the protection of identity, because once you understand the origin of a behavior, you can no longer pretend it is simply your personality. Maybe you aren't naturally distant. Maybe closeness once felt unsafe. Maybe you aren't naturally indecisive. Maybe making the wrong choice once had consequences. You were too young to understand. Maybe you aren't incapable of trusting people. Maybe your mind learned that trust had a price. The behavior may be yours, but its origin may not be. And recognizing that difference creates space. Space between the wound and the person carrying it. That space is where choice begins. You still feel the fear, but you don't automatically obey it. You still feel anger, but you don't immediately weaponize it. You still feel insecurity, but you don't build your entire identity around hiding it. This is not weakness disappearing. It is consciousness becoming stronger than impulse. And perhaps that is what people misunderstand about psychological strength. It isn't becoming emotionally untouchable. It is becoming emotionally honest. Because a person who can admit, "I am jealous," is often less dangerous than the person who insists, "I could never be jealous." The first person can examine the feeling. The second has to project it somewhere else. Carl Jung understood that what we refuse to own often becomes something we see everywhere around us. The shadow becomes dangerous, not because it exists, but because we refuse to recognize its face. And eventually, you begin to understand something unsettling. The parts of yourself you feared most may not have needed destruction. They needed consciousness. And once you stop trying to destroy those parts of yourself, another realization appears. You don't need to become a different person. You need to stop being divided against yourself. Carl Jung believed that psychological wholeness comes from bringing unconscious parts of the personality into consciousness. Not eliminating them, integrating them, because the person who understands their capacity for anger can choose when anger deserves a voice. The person who understands their need for approval can notice when they are performing. The person who understands their fear of abandonment can recognize when they are accepting less than they truly want. Awareness creates distance, and distance creates choice. That may be one of the most important differences between reaction and response. A reaction happens before you have understood what is happening inside you. A response comes after. Someone insults you. The reaction says, "Destroy them." Awareness pauses. Why did that sentence affect me this much? Someone rejects you. The reaction says, "I'll prove them wrong." Awareness asks, why does their opinion determine my worth? Someone leaves. The reaction says, I need them back. Awareness asks, what am I actually afraid of losing? Those questions don't make pain disappear. They make pain visible, and what becomes visible can finally be examined. This is why mental strength can sometimes look like doing nothing, not because you are passive, because you are no longer allowing every emotion to become an instruction. You don't have to answer every message immediately. You don't have to defend every accusation. You don't have to correct every misunderstanding. You don't have to prove your worth to people committed to questioning it. There is power in realizing that not every psychological battle deserves your participation. The strongest response is sometimes no response at all. But there is an even deeper level. Eventually, you stop needing to appear strong. You no longer perform calmness because you are afraid of looking weak. You can admit, "This hurt me," without believing, "This destroyed me." You can say, "I am afraid," without concluding, "I am incapable." You can acknowledge, "I don't know," without feeling, "I am unintelligent." That is psychological maturity, the ability to experience something without turning it into an identity, because emotions are temporary, but the meanings we attach to them can become permanent. You fail once and call yourself a failure. You get rejected once and call yourself unwanted. You make one mistake and decide you are incompetent. The event ends. The identity remains. Mental strength begins when you stop allowing temporary experiences to become permanent definitions of yourself. And slowly, you realize you were never supposed to become someone who feels nothing. You were supposed to become someone who understands what they feel without becoming owned by it. There comes a point when mental strength stops being about what you can endure and becomes about what you are willing to stop tolerating. Not from anger, from clarity. You begin noticing how often exhaustion was created by boundaries you never had, how often resentment appeared because you said yes while something inside you was screaming no, how often you blamed other people for crossing limits you had never clearly established. That realization can be uncomfortable because it means some of the pain was not caused entirely by what people did. It was also shaped by what you repeatedly allowed. Carl Jung understood that consciousness creates responsibility. Once you see a pattern, you cannot completely return to being unaware of it. You may still repeat it, but you can no longer honestly say, "I didn't know." And that is where psychological growth becomes serious. You begin recognizing the difference between compassion and self-abandonment, between forgiveness and permission, between patience and tolerating the same wound repeatedly, between being peaceful and being afraid of confrontation. These things can look identical from the outside, but internally, they come from completely different places. A person can remain silent because they have mastered themselves. Another can remain silent because they are terrified of being rejected. The behavior looks the same. The psychology is completely different. This is why mental strength cannot be measured by appearance. Someone can look incredibly composed while being completely controlled by fear. Another person can appear emotional, yet possess extraordinary psychological stability. Strength isn't always visible. Sometimes, it looks like finally admitting the truth you've been avoiding for years. I stayed because I was afraid to leave. I agreed because I wanted to be accepted. I kept proving myself because I didn't believe I was enough. I blamed them because I didn't want to examine myself. Those admissions can feel like weakness. They aren't. They are moments of consciousness, and consciousness is where the unconscious begins losing its ability to secretly direct your life. Perhaps that is why real psychological growth often feels less like becoming powerful and more like becoming honest. You stop needing a perfect explanation. You stop turning every wound into someone else's fault. You stop pretending every reaction is justified simply because you felt it. You begin asking, what is this emotion trying to reveal? And sometimes, the answer is something you don't want to hear, but you listen anyway, because mental strength isn't the ability to always like what you discover inside yourself. It is the ability to discover it without running away. And eventually, you begin to understand why some people spend their entire lives trying to become mentally strong, while secretly remaining terrified of themselves. They can control their schedule, their appearance, their reputation, their emotions in public. But the moment they are alone, the mind becomes louder, because control over the outside world has never guaranteed control over the inside. Carl Jung understood that the unconscious doesn't need your permission to exist. You can ignore it, you can suppress it, you can distract yourself from it, but you cannot permanently erase it, and eventually, what you refuse to confront begins choosing your reactions for you. That is why some people become obsessed with being productive, not because they love achievement, but because stopping would force them to feel. Some become addicted to relationships, not because they deeply understand love, but because being alone would expose everything they've been avoiding. Some constantly consume information because silence makes them uncomfortable. Some chase money, status, attention, recognition, not because they truly want these things, but because they believe achieving them will finally silence the question. Am I enough? But no achievement can permanently answer a question that was created inside the psyche. The applause fades, the promotion becomes normal, the relationship becomes familiar, the new possession becomes ordinary, and the mind quietly asks again, what now? This is why external success can sometimes coexist with internal emptiness. The person changed their circumstances without changing the psychological pattern underneath them. And eventually, they discover something disturbing. They weren't chasing success. They were running from inadequacy. They weren't seeking love. They were escaping loneliness. They weren't seeking control. They were protecting themselves from uncertainty. Different goals, the same unconscious fear. Mental strength begins when the disguise becomes visible. You stop asking only, what am I trying to achieve? And start asking, what am I trying to avoid feeling? That question can expose an entire life, because sometimes the thing you're chasing is simply the thing you believe will finally make you feel safe. But safety built entirely outside yourself can disappear the moment circumstances change. And perhaps this is where the deepest form of psychological strength begins. Not in becoming independent from everyone, not in becoming cold, not in needing nobody, but in becoming capable of sitting with yourself without immediately needing to escape. No audience, no performance, no distraction, just you and everything you have spent years avoiding. And when you can remain there without running, something inside you becomes quieter. Not because the darkness disappeared, because you finally stopped being afraid of looking at it. And perhaps the final stage of mental strength is not becoming fearless. It is becoming honest enough to know what fear is protecting. Because fear is rarely random. Sometimes it protects an old identity. Sometimes an old wound. Sometimes a version of you that learned long ago that being vulnerable was dangerous. Carl Jung believed that the goal was not to become perfect, but to become whole. And wholeness requires something most people spend their lives avoiding. Contradiction. You can be strong and still need someone. You can be independent and still want love. You can forgive and still walk away. You can be confident and still have days when you doubt yourself. You can be deeply compassionate and still have boundaries. The mature mind stops demanding that only one side of you is allowed to exist. Because the moment you start rejecting parts of yourself, you create another shadow. And the shadow always waits. Perhaps this is why the person who appears completely controlled can sometimes be the most fragile. They cannot tolerate uncertainty, cannot admit mistakes, cannot apologize, cannot be wrong. Their entire identity depends on appearing strong, and anything that threatens that image feels like psychological death. But someone who has already confronted their own contradictions doesn't need that protection. They can say, I was wrong. I was afraid. I wanted approval. I don't know. And remain intact. That is strength, not perfection. Integration, the ability to remain yourself, even when reality forces you to discover something uncomfortable about yourself. And perhaps that is the hidden psychology of mental strength. It is not the absence of weakness, it is the absence of war against your own humanity. You stop trying to become invulnerable. You stop trying to control every outcome. You stop demanding that everyone understand you. You stop needing every wound to have someone else to blame. You simply begin seeing your thoughts, your reactions, your fears, your desires, your patterns, your shadow. And slowly, the person who once reacted to life begins observing it. That shift is almost invisible, but it changes everything, because the world becomes less powerful when you no longer need it to constantly confirm who you are. And maybe the strongest person is not the one who can withstand everything. Maybe it is the person who can finally sit alone with the truth of who they are, without needing to turn away. Carl Jung understood that the journey inward is not always comforting. It can destroy illusions, expose contradictions, separate you from identities you once believed were permanent. But what remains after the illusions disappear is something quieter, something more honest. You, not the person you were told to become, not the person you performed for others, not the person fear demanded, just the person who finally became conscious enough to choose. And perhaps that is the coldest truth about human psychology. You cannot control everything that happens to you. But once you become conscious, you become responsible for what you do with what happens inside you. The mind will always contain darkness. The question was never whether you could eliminate it. The question was whether you could look directly into it without becoming its prisoner. And when you finally can, you don't become someone stronger. You become someone who no longer needs to pretend. That strength means never breaking. You simply stop being afraid of putting yourself back together.